Hello and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to a new episode of the Iblis Manifestations Podcast. Joining me on today's episode is a gentleman who is most known for his work as a photographer, and his name is Dennis Aydogan. Dennis is a photographer, a professional one at that, based in southern Germany. And he does a lot of very interesting portraits, mostly surrounding nature and animals, but also landscapes. And he has developed a very unique and trademark style of his own when it comes to these photographies. And he really has an interesting style. And of course, for a while, I've been promising that on this podcast, I will be bringing on artists that might not necessarily be music related. They have different ways of expressing themselves, different types of mediums. However, of course, at the root of it all, we connected over our love and appreciation for black metal. And of course, we talked about a lot of different things to do with nature, life, just self-expression and certain solitude that you can find in nature, and the value of being present and being in the moment. It was a very enjoyable conversation for me. I very much valued my conversation with Dennis, and I am sure that you guys will enjoy it as well. At the very least, I hope that you will do so anyway. Before we continue to that, as always, thank you to everyone who is tuning in and listening to the podcast. We appreciate your time and your energy for allowing all of these topics to enter your day, essentially, or night. And we very much appreciate it, especially for anyone who chooses to share the episodes, to subscribe to the channel, and to actually engage with us through this. Funnily enough, Dennis actually happened to be one of those people. So I was very honored, of course, to have that feedback from him and to also have him on the show. It has been a real blast. And to all of you out there watching, I wanted to say thank you for tuning in. And if you enjoy what we do, just feel free to share, subscribe, and all that good stuff, and just keep the interaction going. That's really the most that we ask for. So, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, please welcome Dennis Aydogan to Iblis Manifestations. All right, Dennis, good evening and welcome to Iblis Manifestations. It's a pleasure to have you on the podcast, man. How you doing?
Pretty good. How are you?
I'm doing fantastic. Obviously, as we were just speaking, this is quite spontaneous sort of a podcast meeting that we're doing here today. But you know what? I love a challenge. And, just for a clarification for anyone else listening, you and I were only just speaking earlier today where the idea came about. But said, fuck it, let's do it, man. So, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. And it's an honor to be here. I've listened back and forth to a lot of your episodes because I was driving a lot lately. And then I thought, this is all about like sort of music and all of these things that inspired me. So why can't I try to sort of contribute to that factor just by giving something that sort of range of artistry? So that was just the intention to message you, and that's I think one of the most spontaneous sort of online interactions I've had, and it's great, obviously.
Absolutely. I mean, this is like out of pretty much 40 episodes that I've done for the podcast. I've never done this before, but I absolutely thought it was worth doing because I do believe I have seen your work before, and it's just something completely different to what anyone else has ever brought on this show. And obviously, you mainly work as a photographer, and you have your own very unique style of doing that because it's photography that's with nature, which, as anyone could imagine, is actually a very unpredictable thing. And you also have quite a trademark kind of a style of photography as well, which obviously part of that you can put down to like the edits and the technicalities of it, but also having something such as nature, which is so unpredictable and spontaneous, such as the nature of tonight's meeting, I think it makes for it makes for a very interesting results. So just tell us a little bit about your background. How did you end up getting into this, and what led you down this path?
I mean, a lot of people at this point would probably expect something like a story that is rather sort of engaging and maybe emotional, but in reality, the fact or sort of the just essence of what brought me to photography is just sheer spontaneous. Like just like that meeting happened today. I was at a tech store and I wanted to sort of look for something new, and I had a friend there and I just looked at all of the cameras. And I know I used to be into photography back when I was like 14 or 15, when I had like my own first black metal bands. We used to do like shitty digital photos in the forest, and we bumped up the contrast to make it look really grim, and we posed with like sights and stuff like that. So there was always like this artistic visual aspect in me, but I never really thought about like developing it because it was always like something that used to go along with something else that I liked. And then at some point, I was just in this tech store and I thought, fuck it, let's just buy a camera. And my partner at that time was a professional photographer. So I thought sort of connecting with her in that sense would be a good idea, which it was. But I would have never thought that it would turn out this, how do I say, manic in that sense,
Sure.
because it's truly manic the way it all happened.
That's very interesting, man. So you essentially you got into photography further. Was it just to kind of have a reason to spend more time with her or something? Is that what it was essentially?
I guess that was it, yeah. And
Yeah.
the crazy thing is, I remember talking to her dad back then, who was also a photographer, and he tried to get me into photography. And he was like, "Why don't you start photography? You know, it's like a cool thing. We're like sitting in the grass and we're waiting to photograph like with the macro stuff, like some ant coming on a grass." And I was like, "Holy shit, that sounds boring as fuck." So,
But as soon as a girl came along, you changed your mind.
yeah, yeah. But it was
That's
her dad,
interesting.
and I was like thinking about it. I was like, yeah, that sounds boring. But then I saw like the results, and I thought, yeah, okay, well, maybe. And then
Yeah.
later on, I think it kind of dawned on me, and it was like this very spontaneous decision where it was like, okay, let's just do it and see what happens. I never had any intentions with this at the beginning. I don't even know where this led. I wanted to do like stuff because I didn't know like how to approach my visual sort of artistry, because I was always into music and stuff like that, and I always had this dream of like making music and having like my own solo project and whatever. And then this visual sort of artistry came to be, and I was like, okay, how do I make this work? And then I went into a lot of different topics and themes of photography and sort of tried to um, ladder up my way into something I actually enjoyed.
That's fantastic, man. It's interesting how that works. And for the sake of clarity as well, there's no judgment here. I mean, Lemmy only picked up a guitar just because the girls were into it, you know. So as far as I'm concerned, you know, if that's a valid motivation, even if down the line it leads down a much more obviously manic path, as you put it. I think is interesting.
I mean, it wasn't. I think I. This is pretty funny that you say this about Lemmy, because I had like guitars at my place like ever since I was 13. And whenever I had like someone over and they asked me if I can actually like play guitars, I'm like, nah, it's just to impress the girls, which was obviously not true, but it was like a meme going
Right.
on in like my place. I feel that, you
Sure.
know, it was just something that I truly wanted just to connect with her on like sort of a a more personal level, like to get close to her job and actually learn from her. But this like spiraled into something that where I would say, which sounds a little bit arrogant, but that is just what it is. It spiraled to a point where I actually surpassed her in like an artistic level, and
Mhm.
that sort of built the relationship even more because we were able to learn from each other. But that's a past. That's a past. That's how it actually happened. Um,
Fantastic. But obviously that's what you led you to where you are now, which I think is very interesting, man, you know. And it's good that obviously you were able to take on an interest like that and like you said, you know, perhaps even develop your skills further than the expectations. And I think that's a very interesting thing to me. But you also mentioned that, and excuse me, because I'm not familiar with your musical background, but you mentioned that when you were younger, you were also performing in some black metal bands. So can we just quickly touch upon
sure.
that and then see what was going on there? How did you get into that?
So when I was like, I'm 30 now, 17 years ago, or I think 18 years ago, I got into black metal. I found, I don't know how I picked this out. I had like a record store pretty close that had, I don't know how this happened because it was a relatively normal record store, but they had like sort of different records that were picked out of black metal labels for some whatever reason. So, for example, there was a band on Prophecy Records called Dornenreich. There's a black metal band from Germany which had like acoustic guitar elements. They had a tenor, like an opera singer, as
Hmm.
sort of an element in there, and that those were like the first albums where I got like familiar with black metal, and then some very cringe-inducing German acts like Ice Regen. They've become like a cringy meme status here nowadays. And so I like slowly got into that, and I retracked into all of this sort of like 90s, late 80s black metal.
Hmm.
Listened back to all of the records. Got into Dark Throne heavily. I got into Mayhem and all of the other bands associated into that. And I think that sort of developed my interest in music a lot. And then I just started playing guitar and got very familiar with the sort of Bavarian scene here, and got into some bands, and I did some projects myself back when MySpace was a thing. You know, when there was no Bandcamp, but
Yeah.
everybody had like a MySpace page, and everyone was sort of like having a band and just connecting with that. So I did a couple of demos with different bands that unfortunately have no trace anymore. Most of them. One was called Klagesturm, which means like Storm of Sorrow in German. We had another one called, or my solo project was called Urgeist, which is now actually, the name is now actually taken by someone else uh,
Of course.
later on. Of course, yeah, I didn't keep it long enough. It's always like that. Yeah, so I got into that for years and years on end, and tried to sort of develop with different bands and just do my own thing. But um, eventually, it never felt like I was. It eventually never felt like it was my thing. I always wanted to do this. It's been like a lifelong dream to say, okay, I want to do a solo album, but a couple of things held me back, namely music theory, which is not that important in black metal, obviously. Um, but I always felt like I was confined into a box with music. I always felt like um, my technical abilities were limiting me in what I wanted to convey with the sense of
Sure.
music. This is interesting because James talked about this in the last podcast, where he said like he listened to all of these sort of like new wave of heavy metal bands where he realized like, hey, you don't have to be a good lead player. But I didn't have that mentality. I was like very competitive. I was like, I want to be really good and actually provide something that stands out from others. So I never really got anywhere. Truly, I did a couple of things, and I was happy with what I produced, but I felt like confined in the box always. So I'm happy to be able to express myself in a different way now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, it's probably a much more beneficial way, because I think what you're doing now is perhaps a little bit more unique than just putting out a solo black metal album, if I may say. In the
Would
grand
you
scheme
say?
of things, of course, like anything can be unique to itself, because it's your honest, pure expression. But generally
Yeah.
speaking, you're probably making more of a difference with that. And as far as like the technical side of it goes as well, like this is something that we didn't really get into on that episode. And of course, you're relating to the episode with James McBain from Hell Ripper. But for anyone else listening, but one thing that I should also add as well is, funnily enough, when I was back in around, so maybe like around 15 years old, I was writing black metal, but at the same time, I was trying to learn all these riffs by Nile and Necrophagist and
Uh,
Dying Fetus. And even
Technical.
though, yeah, even though I wasn't great at playing them, or even Malmsteen, I was learning a lot of Malmsteen stuff. It helped me a lot. Why? Because then, to your point, like my creativity was less limited, simply because the skill was there. But then what I also didn't realize at the time is that the skill is not just how you perform the instrument, but it's also in production, in layering, and also in promotion and things like that. Songwriting and performance, even though to me is the most attractive part of being a musician, it's actually it's like 5% of the whole thing. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? And it's either way, it's a very interesting experience. But just tell us a little bit. So, how do you think the whole black metal thing perhaps played a role in what you do now, and I guess the more eclectic sense of approach to this particular archetype, having had that background?
I think quite honestly, I think it's probably the biggest influence in everything, just visually. Um,
Very
I
interesting.
I remember when I was like getting into photography and I didn't know like what existed in terms of like artistic expression, because I always thought photography is like this old man's hobby where you get a sort of tripod and then you do some boring ass long exposures of waterfalls and you get really cranked up about that and you show that to your grandma or some stuff like that. I thought it's like an old man's thing.
Sure.
But I got into Instagram, and back then, before I started photography, I always found it kind of ridiculous that people are actually uploading their sort of DSLR high quality photos on an app that downsizes everything anyway. So I found it like very try hard to actually do that. But when I got into photography and I saw like all of these people like actually having a unique style, or let's just put it like some people having a unique style, I was
Hmm.
kind of intrigued by that. And at the beginning, I have to confess that I sort of tried to follow the masses of what works, because I think this applies to music in some sense as well. There's like a general style of popularity that people are sort of going for because they know it works. And obviously they're being influenced by like sort of external factors. And then they maybe even intentionally or unintentionally absorb it and sort of express themselves that way, being heavily influenced by the exact sort of niche they're into. So, for example, being musically influenced while being a musician. So they were visually influenced while being a visual artist. That means that most of those artists I saw were heavily copying each other in terms of spots they photographed, styles they had, and sort of the way they presented things. But that also gave me an opportunity to be able to realize that there's something else than just doing long exposures of waterfalls and being boring. So there was like this entire scene where they would like go wander out into these different countries, Iceland and whatever, and have these yellow rain jackets and photograph themselves in front of like greenish, lush environments. And I thought that this would sort of be an avenue where I could get into. So I tried landscaping and stuff like that. And then I think half a year after that, I realized that's not me. I'm not that type of person who just sort of recycles flavor of the months, right? Because
Sure.
most of those were truly flavors of the month, and I just realized I had to sort of have my personal or my personality be very present in those visual aspects. So I wanted to have this personality be reflected by my images, and that was a slow process. But I think in the most important essence, I think music is the biggest factor of what I sort of convey, because all of these bands I used to like and still love a lot. Agaloch, for example, Ulfer, all of these very melodical, melancholic folk black metal bands, I think, have heavily influenced most of my photography work. And that's something I've only sort of had to dig up. It was a development, but it always was within. So I was able to grasp this sort of aspect of always wanting to have something for my own, like the solo black metal project. But I took the elements and
Yeah.
sort of stirred it up. And I was like, no, this is visual now. This is my visual solo black metal project. You know, that's how
That
that
is very
developed.
interesting. That is very, very interesting that you say that, and there's obviously multiple points that I want to make on that, but just the fact that you say that essentially this is an art form through which you're expressing your own personality. But I think it's a very interesting one in particular. I guess you could relate this to many different things, be it through music or even acting, because essentially the majority of these are still somewhat of an external um, expression. But with photography, especially, it is something that you're not in the photo. However, like you said, your personality is conveyed in there. And I think there's perhaps an appropriate analogy I can come up for this. And it's that obviously, you know, there's the old saying of you observe the world through your own scope, and that is unique with every human being. And whether it's through music, especially black metal, it's parts of your own personality, be it the somberness of it, the melancholy, or even the anger, the rage, the excitement. These things that you might hear, especially in a genre like black metal, and recognize parts of yourself within that. And I think what you're talking about, which is very fascinating to me, is somehow, I guess, actually give an example, like a literal example of how you perceive the world and how you perhaps might capture the animals in their elements and through the scope which you look at the world, which I think is absolutely fascinating to me. And certainly, I think what you mentioned about obviously, the bands that you mentioned, Ulver included, obviously, I think that kind of melodic aspect of it, perhaps if you wanted to connect the dots, I could certainly see a pattern of recognizing that, I guess, perhaps parts of yourself. Or maybe I'm speaking very presumptuously here, but recognizing those kind of the somber elements of things, but then also, rather than it be a negative, it's simply just a state which you then can capture through photography, which in an indirect way very much relates to the music, if that's a good way of observing that.
100%. I think I've also been like individually influenced by certain sort of states or albums in that sense. And it's always interesting to me because very presumptuous of me to say this, but I think in order to develop a unique style in any kind of art, you have to be externally influenced in a unique way. If you only listen to radio music, it's obvious what you could produce because you don't know any other sort of state of mind, emotion, or you don't certainly learn about the layers of, let's say, audio art or just sort of music in itself. So I think
Absolutely.
gathering a lot from outside is sort of the resource I've always used to just convey different emotions. And I think a lot of my photography work is always influenced by certain states that I'm in, or even certain albums I consume before driving to that spot, which is kind of crazy to think of. I've had listened to this German band called Mosaic.
Yeah.
Do you know them?
I am not familiar with them.
Should get into that. They're
Mosaic.
relatively small Thuringian band. They're from Thuringia, Germany, Eastern Germany.
Oh yeah.
Very great, unique sound. And I've listened to the older albums of them. One called they have like this one album. I think it's called Old Man's Winter or whatever, Onset of Winter, and all of these sort of wintry aspects sort of manipulated me, or I wouldn't say manipulated, but they influenced me heavily on this particular shoot I did. And then there was another shoot I particularly remember, to where I mentioned the person on Instagram as well. It was from a live bass player of Magua, The Fall. He has this
Oh yeah.
project called
Michal.
his project called Over the Voids, with this
That's right. Yeah.
Prophet of the Winter song. And I
Yeah, yeah,
listened
yeah,
to
yeah.
this back and forth, and drove to that particular forest spot here in Germany. And I had this song in my mind, and it was like capturing these scenes within me. So I sort of had this tribute set to him, because it just made sense to me, because I was like so heavily influenced by that song that I thought, hey, let's just give it to him. That's like his series.
That's really
Because
cool. Nice.
that's just what's inspired me visually.
That's so interesting. So when you're going out there, what you're telling me is that you're listening to music on the way. However, during the experiences, I'm guessing there's a limitation of any distractions and whatnot, right? Because I would
Yeah.
imagine it's a very intricate process. Like I've even heard of things like just tell me a little bit. Actually, just to take a step back, what is the process like to actually find yourself in isolation of some sorts with these particular types of animals? And just how do you even come across that kind of setting? Did you go through any particular type of training, or was this all self-taught, or how do you even find yourself in these moments? Because I can imagine it's a very sensitive kind of a setting where the smallest thing could like set them off, or they might just want to move on anyway, and obviously you need to get that capture. So what are these experiences like? How do you go about them?
I think for animals and animal photography in itself, I would never call myself a traditional wildlife photographer, because I would say that some of the photos I take are happening through chance or personal contacts. But just what you're mentioning, I think, in terms of actually dealing with wild animals or just animals in general, it takes a very specific person to be able to, how do I say, be with them. Because so there's one thing I've learned, which is very sort of close to a meditative state. I always say this. Even though we think that animals are inherently sort of in a disadvantage because they can think as developed as we do, I think they are at a advantage just because of that point. They do not have thoughts about the past. They do not have thoughts about what might happen in the future. So they're not caged in this mindset of, hey, what's going to happen tomorrow at work? And most of these animals also do not tolerate such a mind state. They don't like this state of mind of you approaching them being baggaged with something that doesn't matter at the moment. So that means, for example, I've been able to photograph wolves and work with wolves. They are in a enclosure. Those are two different packs. And the person I've met who actually granted me access to this, don't want to get too much into this because I don't know if he wants me. He'd be fine, I think, mentioning him, but very interesting person. He's worked with these animals for years and years and years on end, and he has a lot of interesting stories to tell about that. And he sort of allowed me into his world and initiated me with the pack. And one thing I've realized at the beginning, right away when I started working with them, was they do not tolerate your human worries. They do not give a shit. Like that, what you think about the past or the future, if you bring that into their world, that's bullshit for them. They do not accept that. They want you to be present. They want you to be with them, but they don't accept anything else. And that's
So what you're
also
sorry, but what you're saying essentially is that if you've got something on your mind, they can sense it. Is that what you're saying?
100%. Yeah, of course. I think we as
Wow.
humans also have that ability. Obviously, you look at someone at work or outside and you see his face and you see that this person is troubled, or you might not able to pick it up because we've learned to sort of masquerade a lot of these feelings, but they have the sense for it in a deeper level. They, on a very scientific level, they smell sort of our hormones through the sweat we're evaporating, and they can sort of smell cortisol and all of the stress hormones in our bodies, so they can assess something. They might not know that you're worried about going to work tomorrow, but they know that you have some shit going on, and they're like, all right, I don't tolerate that. Fuck off. You cannot be here with something that doesn't matter at the moment. And this is what I've learned applies to all other animals, like mostly all other animals. I had a lot of wild encounters as well, but I'm not the type who sits somewhere and just waits in the woods to on a high to have something come to me. I've always had situations where I was, if we're being very spiritual and esoteric, a lot of people would say you have a thing for animals because they approach you, and it's crazy that you're able to photograph them with a portrait lens. And why are they coming to you? Had the situation with Arctic foxes in Iceland. I've had a situation recently with a fox here who actually waited in front of the car, and I was just going out, and my friend and me, and he was like approaching me very close. But I think it takes a lot of work on yourself. It takes a lot of self-work. What most people nowadays, this is a fancy word called shadow work, where you get familiar with your sort of negative energy and work with that and try to get rid of it. But I think it takes a lot of learning about how you self-work and how your mind works in order to be able to deal with creatures that are obviously in an advantage because they do not think. This is a crazy concept. I know, like a lot of people think they're disadvantaged, but I truly think they are advantaged because they do not have the baggage of having to think of dealing with that one asshole colleague at work tomorrow.
Well, 100%, because they're in the moment, like you said, they're in that primal survival state, which even if there isn't any danger, there's the expectation of it. And like you said, they don't have time for those worries and those things, which, you just think about it, even on an energetic level. Imagine the weight that humanity carries around with itself. It's this fucking, it's this baggage that we're talking about. And obviously, it might not be a literal thing, but in my world, it actually could be. Because I feel like there's a way to these things. I always make this example of some of these strange experiences that I've personally had, where it's like, for example, like I always talk about this, but like, for example, when you have two people who've just had an argument in a room, you walk in that room, you're not aware that they've had an argument, but you instantly feel it.
Yeah.
even without looking at them. It's like you can grab a knife and then just cut through the air with it, you know. And I guess that's the thing that you're talking about. That the wolves in the wild, they can feel that, they can sense that somehow, you know. And I'm like, that could just be like the smell of your hormones, or maybe it's something else. Who knows? But that's very fascinating to me. And you know, I think to your point as well, I think that us humans could definitely take quite a few pages from their book, you know, of how they operate, you know, and how, like you said, because I think one of the main reasons, and perhaps you'll agree with me on this, but one of the main reasons that we even carry around such a weight is purely because we're too fucking comfortable. That we already have everything at our hands, at our access, and we're no longer having to fight for our survival. So we've won against nature, so in a matter of speaking, and now we're just battling ourselves. Really, that's what it feels like.
I think this is definitely a valid point. Um, uh, just the type of struggle they experience. It's just something else entirely. And I even know that they are aware of that struggle. So, for example, I have the story about a falcon my friend had. He's a falconer as well, and they do these sort of flight shows with the falcons and stuff like that. And they're free to roam around during these flight shows, and they let them fly like every single day for 2 times. So they get out of their enclosure and they can like perform or even like sort of do what they usually do. And this particular falcon actually, he flew away for 3 weeks. They weren't able to track him down, nothing at all. But you know what happened after his 3 weeks? He came
What
back.
happened?
Came
Right.
back. Yeah. And you know why? He
Why did that
realized
happen?
that all of those sort of outside elements that actually happen in nature are so much more difficult than what he had in his sort of environment and his sort of own enclosure that is very huge for small falcon. He gets fed every day. He doesn't have to fight with other predators who want his prey or want to eat him in that sense. So 3 weeks of him actually trying to be that sort of primal hunter brought him to the point where he was like, nah, don't want to deal with this. I had a better life before. I get fed. I can fly wherever I want. I'll come back and it's fine. But he had 3 weeks of this natural experience and he thought it wasn't worth it. So that just, in a sense, shows me that we're very pampered, obviously.
Yeah.
But it's a good thing. But we've also lost um, a lot of those sort of intricate aspects of human struggle, the way our bodies are built and all of that. And I think a lot of our perceived issues can be fixed with sort of getting back into recreational habits that might sort of stimulate a lot of the primal aspects of how we are built. I'm not saying that modern society is necessarily doomed or whatever. We're way better off than like 200 years ago. I always find sentiments like that very interesting, where people are like, "Yeah, back then it was better." Like that sentence, that never applied to me. But I think thinking back on a lot of these states and actually applying a couple of these things and getting back to sort of our roots and our natural sort of roots or natural essence, where human is not separate from animal, but human is a animal. To get back to that sense, and I think is very important to actually not feel separated from this sort of broad concept, because truly we are just evolved animals who are able to, or cursed with such a thing as is called thinking. So
I think what you're saying about how in the past, like we would look at that and think, oh, it used to be better, when in reality, in a sense, it really wasn't, because we're living in the most comfortable time of human history where we have more resources than we've ever had. However, I think there's a reason why we refer to it that way. Yeah, you could say part of it is just being naive and not actually being in a survival situation and just finding something to complain about. Yeah, I think everyone's pretty good at that, especially anyone in Europe, or America, or yeah, like UK especially. This is where everyone's like the champions in that. I'm like that sometimes. I'll complain about shit that absolutely should have no room, for discussion. And I always try and remind myself to remain grounded. But I think the reason why we have that kind of approach to the past, where we think it was better, this is something I've thought about a lot. And I feel this is because perhaps in the past things were more balanced. And what do I mean by that? Is that life and death were more balanced, in the sense that life wasn't just constantly being created and not enough deaths happening. And the life that gets created today, it barely has value because there's hardly any struggle attached to it. And as far as I'm concerned, some of that struggle is value of life. Like the hunter gatherer DNA that survives like absolute sheer fucking chaos caused by nature, caused by the environment, caused by disease, caused by temperature, all these things, and yet gets to carries on its genes. That has value. Yet a life born in a fucking office, so like but by parents that do nothing, they have no ambition, they don't exercise physically, they don't do anything. And I'm not saying that life is worthless or it should be deprived of any kind of rights. No, 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 no. However, as far as the quality of it, how we assess value on things, I would say that life is life in today's world very much feels like quantity over quality. And a part of that is the lack of real struggle, because our biggest struggle in life is money, not physical exercise, not running away from predators. And I'm certainly not recommending people to go fuck around with predators either. But I think that that's perhaps where things are going wrong. So to your point, which you did mention this, but I'm a firm believer that the best we can do in modern society is at least create simulations of what that struggle would feel like. For example, going to the gym. I don't go to the gym to, just because I want to look good or whatever. Most of it is because I want to level myself mentally. But I believe the reason why I even need to level myself mentally is because my DNA is used to having struggle, is used to having the challenge. And today's world is not offering me enough of that particular type of challenge. Therefore, I have to embrace it on my own terms and kill the comfort which we all have.
I think this is it's a good point. I personally, I have fucked around with predators, obviously.
Situations, yeah, I guess you have.
That were kind of interesting, but
yeah, I fucked around with aliens instead. Sorry, that's a terrible joke. Carry on, please.
People from the US could probably tell you one or two things about that,
Sure, we will get on to that shortly, but please make your point.
No, but
yeah,
I think it's not replicable by most humans in that sense. But it used to be like a huge, or still am a huge sort of fan of physical activities. I used to be a powerlifter, very big into powerlifting, and then injured myself and got more into sort of a bodybuilding type of style of physical training. But I've always also incorporated cardio and just running, not on treadmills, but like outside in the forest and actually taking in sort of the natural environments we used to run at, which is also way much better on sort of the knees and just with impact running on a forest ground. And that's
absolutely, yeah, that's right. It's better on your joints.
But I've noticed that whenever I feel bad or I feel like I'm in a bad mental state, most of the factors that we're missing were always like physical activity. Because this running high after you go out and you actually
Mm.
run, you come back with such a clear mind. You're very productive afterwards. You feel very, even though you did something strenuous, you feel very energized after that. And I think that's a huge part of doing that recreational work you talked about by like simulating struggles we've had in the past. Um, I know there's a lot of people who might not be physically active, and I don't condemn that at all because I think there's like different ways where people are actually being primarily stimulated, but that's like a very interesting topic as well. But
I think physical activity is even on it. This is in my worldview. I think even on a very minimal level, it should be necessary for everyone because
100%.
I've lived through the experience of what it's like not to have any of it. And honestly, when I look back, I don't know how I even coped with existence. Period. I don't know how I managed to handle anything without that in my life.
Yeah,
And I don't understand how anyone else does it either. And I couldn't be, this is a hill I will happily die on any day, is that you should exercise, even if it's just a little bit, even if it's just like 10 minutes a week, the
yeah.
bare minimum, you should still do it. It's good for you. I will always stand by that.
I think humans are built to walk great distances as well, just from an evolutionary standpoint. No one does that obviously anymore because we don't have the need. And I think it's fine that way, but just even walking 1 hour a day takes away so much of the baggage we usually carry around. And there's one interesting thing. I watched this drunk interview of Fenris from Darkthrone
Of
in
course.
some pub, and he was talking about hiking in forests and whatnot. And he explained this in a very intoxicated state that humans are have a natural reaction to forests because that's something they were always used to see. So a lot of the sort of um, hormones were sort of balancing in that state because it's something that was natural to humans instead of like concrete sort of blocks and whatever, which some people like that. Some people think that's romantic, but I think there's a lot of great sort of solitude to be found in nature, and it's very nourishing. So if you combine that with walks or exercise, I think that's the greatest thing in life you can experience if you're actually feeling down. And that's something I've personally sort of reduced in my darkest times. And looking back at that, I definitely know why those were my darkest times. Just because I think I've left that. I've didn't come back to nature and didn't come back to at least some sort of like something that I was built to do.
Something to ground you, essentially, right?
100%. And this can be like the easiest type of exercise. As I said, it can be walking. It can be more strenuous. Uh, it's it should be there. There should be a balance. I'm not a big city guy. I personally don't understand how people enjoy that. But that
Sure.
might be a very strong opinion. But that's nothing for me. I just exit my door and I walk for 2 minutes and I'm like in a vast forest that you could get lost in. And that's always been something I never wanted to miss. I've had points in my life where this wasn't as important to me, but getting older, I came back to all of these old ways I was experiencing, or sort of I was experienced in, which was being out in nature, just going into the forest, listening to black metal albums on like old cassette players, MP3 players, and I've always felt like this mysticism, this magic surrounding me by walking for miles and miles and miles and wondering what's beyond every sort of corner of forest I passed. I was like, oh my God, next corner is going to be something I've never seen. It's going to be amazing. And no matter if it was just trees or bushes or grass, it always felt like it was something amazing. Was it the music? Maybe, maybe. But later on, I realized that it might have been sort of a combination of actually experiencing nature in the most childlike and curious form, and also enjoying something that complements nature, which is black metal in sort of some
Mm.
genres. So this was a heightened experience of taking something in where people were celebrating nature in a musical way, but sort of taking that and taking my natural curiosity as a child or sort of a teenager to amplify that. And then combined with physical activity, this was like the ultimate thing. The ultimate thing. I would run through
Yeah.
the woods for hours and hours.
It's a beautiful thing, man, and you're right. There's this absolutely reminds me of this very special memory I have, which is from just over 10 years ago. It was January 2013, and I've never spoke about this on here before, or not too many people actually. But I think that's a good time to talk about it. Basically, um, um, I had just been back to Iran for like the first time since I initially moved to the UK,
Mm.
because I moved here for a while and then went back for like a month, and then I came back, and when I came back my mental state was really fucking, it was really hard, like to try and process just that whole thing, because it really dawned on me what being away from home actually meant. It was only like when I got to go back for a very short period of time and then come back to where I already was, and I was like, oh shit, okay, and it's emotionally a very complex thing to try and describe, but also what I was met with was a very very cold winter, full of snow, and I really like snow. I love it. It gives me a sense of calm and peace that not many other things do. I know that most people in the UK hate it, but that's just because they're incompetent in dealing with that kind of weather. But like I remember specifically, there's this park called Sutton Coldfield, which is near Birmingham. And back in the day, that used to be owned by the feudals. And then eventually, I think, sometime in like the 1800s or whatever, I don't remember the exact time, but eventually they had to give it back to the people, and it became public land, and it's this really large, beautiful park in the Midlands area of the United Kingdom. And I went for a walk there, and man, it was so fucking snowy. I had snow all the way up to my knees there, and I was loving it. I just went on my own, and I was obviously listening to this playlist that I made before I went out, because I wasn't using internet, but I had this like little MP3 player then, and obviously on there I had to have Emperor, Thorns, Burzum, Mayhem, Darkthrone, like all of the classics. I put them all on there. And there's this one particular moment where I reached this little river, and by there was like a memorial bench, but it's a very secluded area, even though there's still signs of human construction. And at that moment, it was snowing very heavily, and in my ears, I was listening to this song, "Hell Dwells in Ice," which is by Behemoth. It's from, I think, their first album, and it's like, I don't think Nergal even wrote that song, or I think he just did vocals on it, but it is a very to me it's a very powerfully like emotional song, even though it's super simple riffs and it's not even great production. But that song, I have a lot of connection with it, and listening to that song in that moment when it was snowing and then there was a river there and there was not a single person around. After the song finished, I took my headphones out and I just glanced around for a moment, and you will understand this because you spent a lot of time in snowy environments, I would imagine. When it snows, it blocks the sound of the wind because you don't hear the trees as well. You don't hear the grass. You hear nothing. So to me, when I took off my headphones and the song had finished, it's a very calming song and it ends very somber. I looked around and it was snowing, but it was like the world had stopped, and I'm just looking around in the middle of this thing, and I've never felt peace like I ever did at that moment in my life, where it was like, this is it. This is our world. This is existence. There's nowhere to go. There's nowhere to come from. This is just what it is. This is stillness. at its absolute. And it was a powerful moment. Like, it's something about it, like I can't quite put into words, but it made me feel things which are undescribable. I'm sure you must have had plenty of experiences like that, being in the solitude and also sitting with the animals and the wolves in the wild.
I've had especially like situations where it was just myself and nature itself, but with just still nothing else around me. I'm sure there were like animals and all of these things somewhere pretty close to me. But I've had these situations where, so I, for example, for landscape stuff, which I used to do a lot more. Now it's just maybe sort of more of a hobby thing because I've chosen a path, and in social media, people
Mm-hmm.
like the stuff that they've come for, so you have to kind of stick to it. But I still do a lot of
Sure.
landscape stuff. I've had situations where I was in the mountains of the Bavarian Alps, and I always do this where I go up I pick high altitudes and I hike up there, but I always do it in rain because the natural surroundings get so shrouded by those rain clouds where you actually hike into the rain clouds. I've had situations where I hiked up having music in there. I was listening to Panzerfaust from Darkthrone, which is a simple song, but I think it's the most has this very energetic, almost aggressive, but also very mystical vibe. And I was hiking up there, and all of the clouds were sort of writhing in the trees, like it was sort of a dragon breath. And I was stepping into these clouds, and the mist was getting thicker, and I was able to only like see 1 or 2 meters in front of me. And this sort of situation happened frequently where it was like hiking up and then just standing there, actually having to take a moment to take this in, knowing that I was in full solitude, because no one is that eager to hike in rain, even though some of those paths were well traveled when it's sunny or on a Sunday. But I've had multiple situations where I was like standing there, I was like, holy crap, like that's just me right now. This is my thing. I belong to this. This belongs to me. This is my personal essence. But I've had to learn that as well, because I was sort of like, for some times in my life, I was far away from that feeling and that sense, and I just was able to recap that. And this
Mm.
entire silence thing is very interesting because I think DG can tell you a lot of that in Iceland, because
Probably, yeah.
silence is it's a different word in Iceland, 100%. All of the times I've been to Iceland, I think I've experienced true silence. Here, all of the silence you get to experience in the forest, it's silent, 100%. This is what you're describing. It is truly silent, but
Mm.
silence at a place where nature was built upon solitude and this hostile environment, and there's barely any life in those parts of sort of the national parks and the highlands of Iceland. That was truly a feeling where I was like, holy shit, I'm such a fucking ant. That's what I thought. I was like standing in this vast sort of dune of black sand, and there was this gigantic green volcano towering above me, and a glacier that I couldn't fathom how vast it was very close, and I was standing there uh, in the midst of like a snowstorm coming in, and I was like, holy shit! Like this has so much power. This has way more power than I would ever imagine myself to have. And this has so much more value, worth, and energy than all of my pitiful thoughts could ever sort of capture. And those elements were what truly like sort of amazes me about those things. And with animals, it's always been a instantly calming experience. Like I never had a situation where I was with an animal where I felt fully disturbed or sort of out of a element or just in a everyday element. Like I wasn't feeling like the way I feel when I work in this or look like just walk in the city or go to the mall or go to grocery store, it's an entirely different feeling, even though it's become quite normal to me to visit those two packs my friend is like sort of working with, or just encounter animals in the wild. It's become kind of normal, but it's always a special thing, and it's always a different feeling. But one theme always sticks, and that's true silence, which you were talking about, and true solitude and sort of calamity. It's always like a healing feeling. It's always something that sort of cleanses me, because I look at these beings, I look at animate and inanimate objects, and I always think, this animal, this forest shrouded by mist, is free of worries, and that's what I should be in that moment, because it would be disrespectful to be somewhere else. So being in the moment is the essence of what I want to convey with sort of my imagery, and I think what my person has sort of had to learn to become in order to convey that. So I feel that, dude. I had when you told me that story, I was like inside of it. I was like, I saw all of this, and this it must have been truly great. Is Yeah, experiencing something is like that is it's just it's amazing.
It really
And
is. It's real, but in a different way than we understand real. Does that make sense?
yeah, it is. It feels surreal. It feels surreal, but it is real.
Yeah.
I always say this when I'm like in a very when it's snowing really heavily, and everything is sort of like obstructed by a different element, because I always talk about I do photography coaching and workshops and stuff like that, and I always talk about the element of obstruction uh, with the which comes from conditions such as rain, snow, or fog. You have a familiar environment that you've probably walked through 100 times, but those conditions come in which seem drastic and dramatic, and which were, and this is something we have to keep in mind, those conditions were drastic and dramatic for our forefathers, right? So a lot
Yeah.
of rain wasn't necessarily, in most cases, it was beneficial, but in some cases, it was even dramatic. A lot of snow was not always, mostly not a positive thing. And I think all of those sort of elements also play into our emotional state when experiencing these elements. So I get a familiar environment. This is visually obstructed. It creates mysticism because I cannot look beyond what I'm actually seeing. Like my vision is blocked, so all that's left is imagining something that's behind what I see, which I already know because I've been there 100 times. But it creates this fantasy of like, oh my god, I can pass this corner, and then something else is going to happen, and the mist or the it's going to obstruct everything else, and then it plays into all of these elements and these feelings which we have in us evolutionary. Snow feels calming but also threatening. Rain feels healing and rejuvenating, because I think it's something maybe has to do with crops actually growing and regrowing sort of our way of nourishing ourselves in terms of nutrition and stuff like that. So there's a lot of intricate parts about like wandering in these conditions, which I think play a role in there.
But I think with rain in particular or waterfalls, I think it does something in terms of just, I believe it is called, I think, just perhaps balancing the sort of like the electric nature of things. I believe it has that some kind of a therapeutic in that sense, which I think can be very powerful. But it's interesting that you talk to me about that. So essentially, it's our almost DNA imprinted response to these different climates and things, which, like you say, can affect our mindset and emotions. One very important thing that you've also mentioned as well is how you're trying to create a sense of just being present, which I guess that's the thing that we keep coming back to. And I think that's extremely important because there's being present in the sense of thinking about current events, or like you said, your worries at home, or is like, oh, am I going to have enough? Am I going to be able to afford doing this trip at the end of the month? Have I got enough holidays? Have we got this, that? Like I myself, my mind is like totally fucking like there's so many things going on there. But being present is a different thing. It doesn't mean to think about current things, but rather approach things and your surroundings in a way that you're there, with the sense of alertness and awareness that is primal, which detaches you, like you said, from the past and the future and just brings you to the moment. So every single thing, like for example, when you're talking about walking through the rain and walking through the mountain and the clouds obstruct where it is that you're going, you have to be present because you do not know what's behind that. You can't be walking through that thinking, oh, I wonder how many likes this post will have gotten on Instagram. You have to be completely aware and alert of what's around you. And that in itself, which is something that nature almost without fail always offers us if we open ourselves to it, is a very valuable state of being, which I actually find to be a rather meditative one. Like you just go there and then it just completely resets you. Now, there's the literal ways of grounding, as they say, like if you touch your skin against the grass, or if you walk barefoot on the grass, or even just like your eyes by observing trees and things in the distance rather than just the phone that's constantly in your face. That has a powerful effect on everything. But let's say on a more metaphoric level, how do you find you reflect back on the modern society and life when you do exit nature again, or rather when you've been to nature and then you have to come back to this side? What are your reflections like in that sense?
Personally, I think I'm very rational in that sense. As I've said, don't personally like that sort of approach of like saying, hey, back then it was better or something like that. I always make jokes about myself, like being this sort of grim mountain man in this Instagram world. And I mean, this is to some degree the case, but I choose to be that person. I'm not that. I haven't sort of. I haven't been put in sort of that in that case. I've chosen to be that sort of person who goes out and tries to seek those natural elements in order to thrive off of that and to rejuvenate himself. But I think it's important to keep things realistic and apply what you've learned in a sense where it doesn't become this hatred to the modern world, because that is the way it is right now. And you should be able to take the most important parts of being back in nature, but also take the most important parts of like modern living. So when I get back, I always have this for people, for example, who meditate. I meditate a lot. I always realize that
I noticed you refer to yourself as your person, and I recognize that instantly.
That's great.
There we go. But yeah, man.
That's what that impresses me now. I have to say this, that you picked up on this. It's crazy. Wow. Yeah. I would have never thought that it's noticeable. It's just when you meditate, for example, it depends on how long you meditate or whatever. Afterwards, I think you perceive the world in a different way. I remember this one very specific time of sort of event of meditation. I was in a train and I closed my eyes and meditated. And it was this train filled with people. I meditated for like half an hour or so, and then I came back, opened my eyes, And I was entirely clear, not influenced by any of my thoughts, not influenced by anything outside. But the only thing I could notice were um, all of these people, like everybody that I was able to observe, stared into their phone. And I'm not the type of person to say, oh, wow, you're like a cell phone slave. I didn't observe this in a way where I said, oh, those people are enslaved. They didn't experience this heightened sense that I now experience. That's not my way, because obviously I have a large following on Instagram. I have to be a cell phone slave. But I
Right. Okay. Yeah.
I looked
Interesting.
at these people and I thought, I was kind of sad. I was like, wow, they are not truly in the moment right now. I am truly in
Mm.
the moment, but I had to work for it. And I knew this wouldn't last for a long time. And then I realized, hey, maybe half an hour, I'll be that person on my phone, 100%. I cannot lie about that. And I went up on my phone, but I filtered through everything, experienced everything in a different way. And that's the same way coming back from nature. I take things in a slower way. I appreciate what I've just experienced, especially walking in rain somehow sort of grounds me very well and calms me down to a certain degree. So what I like, what my takeaway is from being in such an environment which is inherently like meditative, is to sort of apply the calm aspect of nature towards things that truly work against it. Worries, stupid things that we worry about, especially. I
Mhm.
think those things can be eradicated with just sort of grounding yourself over and over again, having these walks and going there. But let's be real. I think um, it's not a permanent state. No, it's not, because
Yeah.
we're within this world and we have a lot of external influences. We have lots of screens, lots of lights everywhere, lots of sounds. We're influenced by everything that's flashy and loud. That's just human nature. But I think it's important to know that there's something that grounds us. You have the ability to just go out and walk and just have that grounding whenever you want. So use it as a tool. If I feel disturbed, or if I feel worried or unhappy, or I feel like I'm not in balance, I just go out and walk. So I use this tool over and over. It doesn't last long, and that's just the reality of it. But I can just use it whenever I want to. And yeah, I think it's absolutely important to not be the old man who yells at the clouds saying, "Oh, you guys are on your phone doing some bullshit, and this modern world is fucked up." But you should have it
Yeah.
in a balance where you're like, I use these modern tools as good as possible and not be against it, but also have the benefit of knowing what sort of um, used to be a way of relaxing for people that came before my time, and what my human essence is about, if that makes sense.
For sure. I think, just looking at it from the perspective of let's say a modern person, quote unquote modern person, and this is probably something that I myself have actually been through. I think you have to go through this, but it's that sense of, when we talk about things like meditation, grounding, or like when you're talking about being in Iceland and feeling that vast kind of empty nothingness, in a sense. Well, not the nothingness, but the rather how small your own being is against that. One very difficult place to be in, I think, for us as human beings is obviously, I think the way that the ego gets to develop sometimes can deceive us, very much so. And I think that deception is actually our probably one of humanity's biggest enemies, and that's something that makes us sweep things under the rug. So, for example, like one of the reasons why there are many people out there, myself included, in the past, not nowadays, but in the past, where you can't fall asleep without noise. You know, those kind of things where that's actually very common. Why? Because when the noise goes away, then you get to hear the thoughts, and those thoughts aren't always comfortable. But even, if you put yourself in a situation where you're in nature and you feel the the vast emptiness of space, just the understanding that we're on this dot of dirt flying around this ball of gas, which compared to a lot of other things isn't really that large. And all of the stars surrounding us have died many years ago, but the light hasn't stopped reaching us yet. And what it is that we're surrounded by is an extremely, not only just scary, but it's a very lonely existence when you think of the world like that. However, you can the true meaning, or I suppose what surpasses what even the meaning is, because sometimes we just don't understand the meaning, but the true value, I think, of life even being here is knowing that it exists even despite all of that, and the fact that you get to walk this ground and to observe and to look and to feel and to smell, and but to also love and to hate and to feel all of these things whilst in the middle of such a thing. I think that's what makes this all very special. And I think that as a person, if you can find your peace within that, then you're winning. Then you're a part of the universe, and the universe is you. And I think that is really where a lot of this, where a lot of our true potential lies. It's away from the bullshit the noise that we create ourselves to, because the silence can be deafening. So we need the noise to bury it under the rug. But like you said, this existence is not forever. So the most valuable thing in my eyes, from what I have learned throughout the years that I've existed as this person, is the fact that you have to find your peace and meaning in that more than anything. And a little bit of noise every now and then is okay. But that's what I love about being in a black metal band, is because I get to take all of my bullshit and funnel it out through the most fucking grandiose, powerful experience, high voltage, loud, all this screaming and the fucking testosterone, and just like shoot a load into the ether. And then when all of that is done, go into silence and experience the world for what it truly is.
Maybe I'll have to actually start my solo project now.
I think that's a good sales pitch, right?
It was. No, I'm actually. This makes a lot of sense to me. Yeah, I see this, especially with some of the records. The latest Mysteriming record, I think, also sort of embodies that very well. And the moment I sort of turned that on, I realized that there was like it was just an outlet of human aggression, of frustration. And when he talked about the writing process of like sort of letting go things and writing it in rage, I think this is something I felt when listening to this. With my
I think
work,
that's what I'm saying is that, like, when you kind of get that aggression out, you can't constantly be in that state. That's like one state of explosion. And then when eventually the dust will settle and you'll have to face your true feelings, or in another matter of speaking, the swelling always goes down. So I think
I have to find my way of exploding in that sense. But that's something I notice. My visual expression is always very calm, and back when the real thing wasn't a thing and I was only posting photos, which quick disclaimer, I like photography way more than filmmaking, but I just had to adapt because of how the social media world works right now.
Of course, yeah, reels, that's right.
Yeah. I have to thank them.
Understand.
I cannot be resentful towards them because they've gotten me a lot of exposure and followers. But back when I was only a photographer, people would always say, wow, like your work is very calming. And that's sort of the nature of my person. I'm a very, how do I say, calm person externally. But there were moments in my life where I felt a pent-up rage or something that was more akin to aggression. And I would say that I can be aggressive human. I think I'm internally very aggressive, but I never let it out. And I think this is where something like that would benefit me in that sense. But there's going to be
And I
something coming at some point. I can promise that.
That
Yeah.
sounds exciting, man. And I guess that's a part of what even allows you to be able to sit with wolves, and I guess that calm presence that you're able to offer them, which obviously, like you said, you have to work for that internally in order to be able to project it externally, right?
100%. But there's like something that is also interesting about wolves, which I think is not a trait of human nature. Even when they're aggressive and they're threatening each other and sort of assessing their ranks, they seem to be externally aggressive, but you can feel the internal calmness. You know that because our human aggression is always based upon thoughts, right? Aggression
Mm-hmm.
builds up within thoughts, and then we are able, because we're thinking, we're able to spiral it up and actually add to what happened and just imagine things. You know, when you had an argument, or you don't even, this is the craziest thing, literally, the craziest thing any human has. And anyone listening to this would be bullshitting me, not sort of accepting that this happened at least once in that person's life, and which is
Mm-hmm.
you have sort of a situation that you're about to approach, which could be a conflict. It could be a conflict. So you walk to that appointment, or you just go along your way and you think through all of the things you're going to say to that person in that conflict situation, which will, I will fucking promise you, 90% never even arise. So you play through this whole theater of conflicts where you're like, I'm going to say this to this person and he is this and that and that. And you play up and you rage up, and then you are in that appointment and it never happens. So this also applies to having had conflicts and then adding upon it, thinking about what you could have said and what you might have said, or what upset the person even more. And so it's crazy how caged we are by just letting our
Mm.
thoughts escalate before things have even happened, or after things happening, where after things happen to just let it go on for hours. People have a confrontation and then
I should have
they
said that. I should have said this.
yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
fuck.
this
Yeah,
is,
I know.
it's crazy. And looking at these animals, they sort of assess their ranks. They fight because they don't like the behavior of the other one, or it's about food or territorial issues or whatever. And they fight, and that's it. You know, they 100%. They just fight, and they don't go back to their den and thinking, "Oh, this asshole! I could have told him that his wife is ugly," because they don't work that way. You know, they
No, they
don't
just
work
go
that
and
way.
fuck the wife.
Well, that is the most primal way.
Yeah. Or
No,
eat
but
their kids.
yeah, that's the, you know, they don't
Yeah,
think about that.
that's
They
it.
don't
Yeah.
have that sort of they don't have that developed sense of hatred and aggression, but we have that, where we literally
Mm.
create worlds in our head, and we're thinking
Yeah.
for another person. We're like thinking, oh, this guy thinks that, you know, and it's kind of crazy.
Yeah, you always
It's
get
actually
that.
kind of
It's
crazy.
like someone does something and you keep thinking to yourself, "Oh, is that person is fucking with me on purpose, aren't they?" You know, and then that
Yeah,
person might not have a clue. They're not even thinking about you, you know, and I always try and be careful of that, you know, because even if they are doing something on purpose, then, you know, there's some kind of a problem there that either needs to be addressed, or you simply need to work through it until the situation is over with, you know. And it's yeah, I get what you're saying, man. And another thing is as well, you know, we live in a very isolated kind of world as well. We don't really live in communities, you know. I think a lot of times, if you I think the perfect format of the human existence, I would think, whilst it would have its downfalls, is probably in a tribe format, which is ironic to me because a lot of very like modern ways of thinking, like you'll see a lot of articles and things criticizing that, bashing that, trying to stop people from getting into tribes, because as soon as you get into a tribe, then automatically you gotta be some kind of an extremist or whatever, or what does being an extremist even mean now anyway? You know what I mean? It's like that's another hijacked fucking word which they'll use for anything, and like it's a fucking crazy thing to me, because I think that in communities, in situations of tribes, I think we excel the best, because I also think that, and I might be naive in saying this, but I think that a lot of times when you're in that situation, you have accountability to those people close to you. And the same goes for everyone. And you don't have time to keep shit to yourself. You have to communicate, because all of your survivals depend on it. You can't just like be in a situation where you're just gonna like betray someone or whatever, just to like outrun them. You need all the resources you can get from everyone in the group, unless it's someone who like eats all the food, and does fuck all in return. Then that's, you all have to work together. And I think the lack of that, the lack of a sense of community in today's world, which you especially see in countries like countries that have say, so for example, somewhere like the UK, where you do have a lot of diversity, but there's no sort of communication between those different groups. There's no, hey, let's at least communicate with each other what we're doing. Let's try and understand each other's traditions. It's just like, no, we're doing things our way. You want to do things your way? Fine, go and do that. Fuck you. It's like, and that creates this real sense of a real divide, which seems disastrous to me, because it's like you're putting people next to each other that don't agree with each other on jack shit, and then you're making them have to live in the same society, and a lot of people end up feeling isolated and lonely, and I'm not just talking about like the issue of, for example, like country people or whatever, but or like race, but this, I think, has like a domino effect all across the board on everyone, in my opinion anyway, having come from a different country where it's mostly the same people, and then observing what things are like over here.
I feel that. I think sort of the biggest telltale thing I always think about is when my father came to Germany when he was 3 years old from Turkey. They immigrated. My grandpa, he was a goat herd, like a real goat herd. They were he built his house out of like sort of mud and like straw and all of that stuff, like literal, like some medieval ingenuity stuff. And he did all this goat herding, and they were eating goat cheese and all of these different things he traded from the furs and stuff like that.
I can see why you got into black metal. It's all the goats.
Yeah, it's a goat lord. The goat lord.
That's it. The goat penis.
Yeah, it was my grandpa. Sure. Who was a goat lord.
That's cool, man. That's very, very cool. So he did that in Germany. So he actually like built his own house and.
No, he did it in Turkey. My
in Turkey, right? Of course.
And then this is how my dad grew up until like he was 3 years old, and then my grandpa got hired by a German company, and they had this work opportunity. There was a Turkish spokesman. I think they're Turkish Kurdish, so like mountain people essentially. Some like somewhere half Kurdish, half Turkish, German, whatever, mixed pot. But there's a spokesperson going up to the mountains and telling these people like, hey, why do you do this stupid goat shit? You can just go to Germany and work in a sort of a carpet factory and earn a lot of money and integrate into the country. And while like sort of all of that happened, there's a lot of things my father told me and still tells me about where I think it is very apparent that some ways of modern societies don't essentially work very well. So, for example, when they immigrated, they were putting them essentially in places where they were only by themselves. So they thought it's a good idea because, of course, they're all Turkish. They would just put them in the same area, basically isolating them, maybe not even purposefully. And actually them then building their own community, but being actually sort of isolated from the actual country, which then in that sense also created issues in education as well. They put him in a
Yeah,
class where it was only Turkish people. No one gave a shit about it. And if they had mixed the people, they had to learn the culture of the country they were in and actually
exactly.
integrate and talk to each other. And this would build sort of more trust in each other. But what they did, maybe like in a naive way, saying, "Oh yeah, they want to be with themselves," so they just put them in a separate area. So this leads to a interesting sort of influence to me as well, because my father grew up in this sort of with this mountain man. Like my grandpa is this mountain man who was a goat herder and built his house with his hands and stuff like that. So my dad only knew this way of living. So he would skip school and go out in this German city. It wasn't a village. It was a relatively large city where he would go out, skip school. He said fuck school, and
Yeah.
he hunted. He fished. He illegally fished.
Ah,
He sort of gathered all of the resources for the family, even though they were in modern society. My dad grew up doing some caveman shit, like literally. The stories he tells
I
me
like
about
it.
like getting into swimming in all of the sort of canal waters in the in the city and catching fish with his hands. And I think he catched thousands of thousands of fishes back then, and actually sort of provided for the whole family. He built a, you cannot say this legally, but that's just what he did. It's so far back that I just have to drop it. He built his own slingshots and shot like ducks and geese and brought them back home. And it was this modern society. It was 1980s Germany, and this man was like what everybody imagines to be this hunter stereotype. And this man raised me. So he
Wow.
gathered all of this. He got familiar with all of the mushrooms in the forest. So he was this real self-providing person. He said fuck education. He didn't give a shit about that because he didn't know this was important. He had this mountain man sort of style in himself. And I think this is also a huge part what influenced me as a human, to know that my dad, who's now has a very high position in a electroplating company, or sort of a connector company now, and has a high, he's actually yeah, very high sort of
Hmm.
position in that company. Used to be like a guy who hunts like ducks and with slingshots and catches fish with his hands. But you see, I think he hasn't lost this. He hasn't lost the ability. I know this, and he hasn't lost that touch with sort of this primal part of himself. And that just sort of, that man raised me, and I think I've this sort of love for nature and this internal aggression, I think, is something I've inherited from him 100%. 100%.
I think absolutely you are very lucky that that is the case, because what better education than what he did compared to the bullshit that you would get in school, especially under the conditions which you explained. I mean, just to that point earlier, there's Polish people in the UK who've been here for 40 years and still don't know how to speak English, and that's a direct result of such consequences, really, when you do that to people, just like you were explaining. But that's amazing about your father. He sounds like a cool guy. What and I think in today's world, the thing is that you just have to a lot of times just take matters into your own hands, be it your own tribe or your own profession or what it is that you're doing. I think that is the way. The way is to walk your own path, because the system as it is doesn't care for your goals and ambitions, but rather just to keep you where you are and essentially use you as like a piece of battery, or like a generator for its own self. So it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. And there's ways to use this system, and absolutely we all do. You and I are using it, just having this conversation right now. However, it is important to be able to find our own way, which I believe that at the very least you have, at least when it comes to your art and the career. Dennis, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you tonight, man. What a fucking cool conversation. I'm so glad that we made this happen, man. Really cool.
Love this so. I mean, yeah, it's been very, very spontaneous, but I think the result has been great. I don't know. I thought about it being a good idea, and I think it might have turned out to be very fruitful and just very enriching. And it's been certainly also great to get to know you and have some of your inputs and actually been able to contribute with some of the things I've experienced so far.
For sure, man. Yeah, I'm super glad that we did this, and I think just throughout the conversation, I think you and I think understand each other, and that's a very important thing. It doesn't happen often with me, but I appreciate you coming on, man. I guess just to round things up, where can people check out your work if they haven't done so already? And have you got any particular projects up and coming that you want people to look out for?
There's a couple of things coming.
Sure.
I'll be exhibiting work later at the end of this year in the Bavarian or National Park of the Bavarian Forest, with something I might do in Svalbard in the Arctic.
Cool.
But that's just something I'm dropping now. Barely anyone knows about that. That's just in planning, and I'm very excited to be able to also announce that I'll be doing a 10-minute movie towards that and just documenting sort of the Arctic in that way, and also be composing my own music in that 10-minute piece.
Ah, that's cool as fuck, man. You heard it here first, ladies and gentlemen. That sounds very, very exciting.
And then other than that, my website, which is I think it's too hard to spell that on the podcast. So
there will be links to it anyway.
Yeah.
Whatever it is that you want sharing with the people, I'll provide a link. So if people want to check out any of your work, then that should be in the description, whether it's on YouTube, Spotify, wherever, it'll be there.
I think the easiest way to just look me up on Instagram, but that's not what I'm here for. I'm not here to gain a couple of more followers. I think I'm just here to get to know you, and thank you for providing me with sort of interesting interviews with people I've enjoyed with, and I'm just here to maybe influence someone in a positive way. We always talk about influencers these days, and I want to do my part even more now, and I want to show my face even more on my Instagram and talk about not only photography, but maybe about things that people are struggling with, especially in this generation. And I want to truly influence people to experience nature and actually use those tools to better their life. So it is not important to me to gain more followers or anything like that. I just want to influence people in a positive way.
Well, I think we've certainly must have done that with this one, as it's been a very wholesome conversation, and I do very much appreciate you coming on, man. Probably one of my favorite chats on Iblis so far. So yeah, it's great to have you on, man. Yeah, so yeah, Dennis, thank you so much, not just for coming on, but also for your words of support as well. Glad to have a listener on the show. Yeah, it always makes things interesting. But yeah, man, thank you so much. For anyone else listening as well, obviously be sure to go and check out Dennis's work if you already haven't done so, and I'm sure you can reach out to him on Instagram, and obviously his email address and all of his other work will be available there as well. As always, thank you all for listening to another episode of Iblis Manifestations, and yeah, hope to see you guys on the next one. Dankeschön and auf Wiedersehen. Bye bye.